This event tonight is called a launch of a forthcoming issue of the journal Scapegoat, Architecture, Landscape, Political Economy. It's not a launch because the issue is still in progress, but it is a kind of a preview, and the two speakers that we have tonight are both contributing in different ways. So tonight we have a conversation between two very inspiring cultural producers. Ange Loft is an artist and associate artistic director of Jumbley's Theatre in Toronto, but she also has an independent artistic practice and is a vocalist in the band YAMANTAKA Sonic Titan. So she has a very wide-ranging artistic practice, really focused a lot on collaborations with people and communities. And David Fortin is an architect, and he is the director of the Laurentian School of Architecture. You're also the director of the Indigenous Institute at Laurentian University. David's interests include architecture and science fiction, Métis vernacular architectures, and also is thinking a lot, and he's going to talk about tonight, his interest in thinking about how Indigenous architects can collaborate with communities to produce architecture which is more deeply rooted in the places and peoples in which it's located. So David and I are co-editing this next issue of Scapegoat, and it's tentatively called Canada: Fences, Blockades, or Taking Care. And it comes out of a set of questions about the relationship between architectural typology, urban morphology, and property, and the settler colonialism that produced those things in Canada. So it really comes from trying to mash together two different discourses, which most people don't put together. One of them is an architectural discourse about the way in which the property divisions of land, first agricultural property divisions, and then the subdivisions of those agricultural property divisions into private house lots, produces the fundamental architectural form of cities. Cities are kind of predetermined by the property lines on which they're made. But the problem is that this land, of course, had a history long before those lines were placed on it. And so that land was Indigenous land, and it had no strict boundaries on it. And so these lines are quite artificial constructions, and in some ways they're very modern constructions. They're really, these property lines are things that were invented in the modern period. So the history of the earth has had many different ways of thinking about land and about the division of land. And so we're interested in exploring that. And I'm going to quickly just move through a couple of images. I mean, this is something Ange's going to talk a lot about in her talk, the Toronto Purchase. And it's, from an architectural point of view, such a strange abstraction. We have here this kind of rectilinear box placed on the land, and the city then forms within that box. So this is a drawing that wasn't included in a very famous article by George Baird called Theory, Vacant Lots in Toronto, in which he really talks about how urban morphology is based in property lines. And he includes these images, which show the first settlements of the city, but not the contractual agreements that produced the space in which those things happened. And so it's that gap in the architectural history that we're interested in addressing with the issue. And so George is very interested in the kind of changing morphology of the city according to its property lines, and the way architecture is produced on those properties in very specific ways based on their form. But we were also struck by the work of the Six Nations of the Grand River Land Claims Office, which was doing very similar kinds of research at about the same time, starting in the 1970s, looking at the division of land down to the lot divisions of property, and doing it for a very different purpose, which was to understand the problematic relations under which that land was exchanged or taken. And so the Land Claims Office examines the kind of history of each of these parcels to see what the exact exchange relations were with the Six Nations, and to kind of think about the value of that land, and even to think about it in dollars in the present as a way of thinking about how to negotiate a better relationship with between settler colonial people and Indigenous people in this area. And so the issue kind of deals with those issues, and Ange and David are going to talk about them in very different ways, and then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation. And Ange is going to begin.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Ange Loft, and I'm from Kahnawake Kanienkehaka Territory, so that's close to Montreal. But I've been living in Toronto for around 12 years, and I've been working with this company called Jumblee's Theatre. So we're an organization that's been investigating a lot of what's under our feet for the purpose of trying to make theatre. Now, that's not the only thing we do. We work with communities, we find stories in those locations, and try to figure out how to make them into large-scale, performative, multi-arts experiences. So this is one example of course, one type of project. You can do the same type of project in any community. There's a lot of different ways to feed information in and get information from people. So this is kind of a conversation just to show you a lot of the aspects that go into the work. But before that, I'm going to start you off with a little excerpt. So just 30 seconds.
Described the Toronto Purchase and all of the things that happened around that time and around the purchase as a skullduggery, and how it was a very dramatic time.
Now, if you believe that you're a nation and someone's coming in and starting to tell you how to conduct yourself, it's sort of like this. You had a house. The neighbor moves into your house. Pretty soon he kicks you out. It's still your house. And you will always believe it's your house.
You have to remember, the First Nations people did not have a written language. So without a written language, you had a spoken word.
Because to talk about treaties, you really do have to understand colonization before
I'm going to
you
pause
can
this
really
for a second.
He described
Sorry, I can't get
the
under here.
Toronto Purchase and all of the things that happened.
Let me try to just make that stop. There we go. So just to get your ears into tuning, we talk to a lot of people. So at Jumblee's, a lot of the work we do is oral narratives. We speak to a lot of people, think about the research we want to get out of them, because Jumblee's is right near Fort York. So if you know Toronto downtown, it's right in City Place area. So that's a brand new condo development zone. But as they build those structures, they have to dig down. And when they dig down, they realize that the land underneath is pretty much all fill. And it takes about 6 months to get for those rocks to push into the base of the bases of those holes when they built those structures, and they got to shave those back and then come back up with the buildings. But we've hit into, boats, old docks, the things that are buried underneath those zones, military places, more or less. Also the old community underneath our feet. So a lot of those questions, bringing that to the area, thinking about how do we transfer those into what we're interested in, which is making art and fabric things. So this is one experiment which sort of started in the beginning of our research for Talking Treaties. So the project has been initiated in 2015 with a bunch of interviews and talking to people and speaking to people who will bring this information, bring us information about Torontonians, Indigenous people in particular, relationship to treaty, but also really acknowledgement of a lot of the missing layers when you talk about Toronto. So this is working with Lost Rivers, thinking about the lost rivers of Toronto. Toronto buried a lot of its rivers, as did a lot of our communities around here. And what has that done to our literal foundations of our buildings? It's been frustrating because a lot of us fled. But my house is on the old Garrison Creek. So it's our basement we have to really watch out. The cities is also built right on top of these sites. So this is by York University, actually really right across the highway from Black Creek Pioneer Village. And when this excavation was happening, they ended up actually turning it was a really interesting moment because there was a proposal for thinking about how to make this into a cultural visiting location, right? And very soon after, the funding, actually some of the municipal funding went towards Black Creek Pioneer Village. So just thinking about what narratives are getting funded, what conversations about structures are being promoted in our city. This stuff is literally buried between two condos, old community housing units. This is under the ground of that site. So thinking about this, thinking about how have people lived so close to each other in Toronto for such a long time has brought us some of these questions that we've been thinking through with the project Talking Treaties, because it's not just about Treaty 13. We want to go further back. So with that, my own personal interest is in how do we make decisions together? How do we share information? How do we share, literally, they're sharing spaces. They're sharing little garbage pits, and it's interesting to see how things develop. So how do you get into such a multi-level narrative about a place, particularly when you have multiple nations in the area? It's not just one nation's history. Toronto's been an overlapping place for a long time. So I'm a theater artist. I work with a lot of different other theater artists, and this is one of our quick creation processes. So sending people all of this information, overwhelming them with historical content, and then smashing them together to make things that are performative, durational, and multi-arts. That's how you get some information out. That's how you get to some of that, what they say, like the intention behind the words. So what they mentioned in that, in the little excerpt I had there was that sometimes you have conversation points that have lost their intention behind them. The treaties are now down to a paper document when the spirit of what happened when they were actually going into those conversations has been pretty challenging, actually, to figure out what was actually intended by both parties, particularly when one group is not being listened to. So with these interviews that I conducted, this is just really quickly, I'll show you some of the fun things that came out of the interview work. So we filtered some of it through Rosary Spence, vocalist, made us some great songs, particularly working with some of that text that I'm afraid of, narratives around things being sacred, stuff being beautiful, like the rivers, the water always has a memory. The water will always go back to the same spots. You can't reroute a river, no matter what, it'll find its way to trickle through. So we work with a really large choir. We work with a really large community, and bringing people into these conversations has been, and really working with the same people over many years, that's the way you learn about these things. You can't learn about these things once. You have to feel them, you have to sing about them, you got to dance about them, you got to design things around them, challenge yourself to think through these things more than one time, because I guess in an oral, to counter the paper narratives, it's really important that these people return to the conversations. And those are some of the things that are kind of built into a lot of our treaty making kind of processes, is the expectation to return to talk, the expectation to polish the chain, the expectation that the treaty partner is in relationship with the people who made the agreements. So with that in mind, it's important to bring people back to the same spot. And so we have community planning, we have community programming that happens in this place called the ground floor. And it's the ground floor of an actual condo building that's rented from the Toronto Community Housing. Right now we're actually in a bit of a dispute to make sure that we don't get kicked out of the building. And in return for that, because we've run out of our subsidized building time, more or less, as a community organization. So we're fighting to get our subsidy back to stay in that building. And one of the caveats is that we have to do local programming. So we have to go into the upstairs, kind of like community dance studio place, do some dance programming, do some after school kids programming to be able to stay in that basement of the building. But that's a community housing unit. So that has people who are dependent on our programming to be social. A lot of people with mobility issues, as you noticed in this previous, a lot of people are in the building who work with us. And so what happens when we leave? What happens when you take a community organization out of the community? It's a good question. So get to business. This is images. The Toronto Purchase is full of these really wild, beautiful imagery. So how do you take away the words and add images to it? How do we think about what are the symbols that are missing in Toronto, which would point us to governance structures, that would point us to important images like the Mississaugas totem being the white-headed eagle. where on the city crest it's been modified to be a golden-headed eagle. So it's a bigger conversation about what it means when you change signifiers and how does that eagle actually represent also the additional nations that are in the territory, because the place has been fought over for a long time. We all know about this is a beaver factory, so we made a bunch of these beavers, which was part of the performance, one of our outdoor performances at Fort York. So I work with Fort York to stage these things outside for the purpose of Fort York would have been one of these locations, I think, this is not my theory, but Alan Corbière goes on talking about how in the Treaty of Niagara, there are, in one of the wampums given from the English to the nations that were gathered at Niagara, there's a lot of images of these kind of circular forms. And the theory, one of these theories is that those were actually European forts at the time. And so that's an invitation to return to talk at those locations. So this is an active initiation of trying to return this discussion to Fort York, because Fort York would have been one of those locations that would have been open to getting information and returning to consultation with Indigenous nations in the area. So bring some content back to them, and they're pretty open. It's kind of nice to have a partner like that close by. Multiple nations being in this area. The reason why? Beavers. So what is the rivers, what do those areas have to do with anything? Beavers and access to those thick furs. So why is Toronto where it is? Because it's at the bottom of the Carrying Place Trail. That's the answer. So the other aspect of what comes up very soon after, once you start trading, is buying people off. And that's a really big aspect in the conversation around, particularly the Toronto Purchase. So we asked our community members, there's been about 300 people that helped do this. Actually, we made about 120 frames. We made 96 gallons of rum. We made some lace hats. We made a lot of, not all, but a very good semblance of the pile of goods that was paid or considered payment for the Toronto Purchase. So this was, I'll go into a little bit with the video I'm going to show in a moment. But this is our community movement squad. Just, let's just say that amount of goods for a lot of information, a lot of land. So this is the official way. You want to talk about the Toronto Purchase, that shape that you just saw. This is the rectangle. This is on Etobicoke Creek. So the focus of the narrative I'm going to show you right now is on Etobicoke Creek. Because it's the edge of the Toronto Purchase and the beginning of what they call the Mississauga Tract. So and that meeting, we won't get to all of the information, but essentially the same meeting where they confirmed this sketchy Toronto Purchase, which was never really, the boundaries were never fully defined in the first run of it. When they confirmed that amount, in that very same meeting, the Mississaugas were also pressured to give up all the way to the Credit River, all the way up to Etobicoke Creek. So imagine arriving for a meeting and you think you're talking about one thing, and then they slip in another piece of paper and you say, oh, I have to sign this thing. So a lot of sketchy stuff really fast. I'm going to play this clip now, if I can see it. Let's see. I don't know how to do this. Sorry, it's, maybe I have to do it this way. Yeah, okay. And so I'm going to skip into this video a bit. So the project was a spectacle. It was also about 100 different community workshops in universities with theater people, with design people, with regular standard people, with art lovers, anybody. This is my time to start my video. There we go. But that idea of doing something with a lot of people, we kind of minimized it a little bit. The scope of the whole, what I called the Talking Treaties spectacle, covered 3 basic agreements, which all are related to architecture. The Dish with One Spoon, the Treaty of Niagara, and then the Toronto Purchase. That's our focus for our project. There are multiple other agreements we could talk about when talking to Toronto, but those are our basis. So what I did with this video for the Toronto Biennial, this inaugural one, was take that main story, pull a lot of our excerpts of history information and audio, our interviews we've done with people, and pull them together, bring back our same performance team, and make something that would try to keep people interested. How do you get people to think about old texts in a fun way?
So,
in 1788, your surveyor attempted to survey the lands of the Toronto Purchase. He measured only along the waterfront and left the other boundary lines incomplete. I desired the interpreter to signify to the Indian chief the spot. Instead of going to the lower end of the beach, which forms the harbor, the chief brought me to the river called on the plan Kahnawake, which is nearer the old fort than the place you mention in your instructions. He insisted they'd sold the land no further. To prevent disputes, I had to put it off for some days longer, until a few more chiefs came in and Mr. Lyons settled with them, so that the eastern boundary was extended to Ashbridges Bay. I continued my westward survey until I came to the Humber River, which the Indians looked upon to be the west boundary of the Purchase, till Colonel Butler got them prevailed upon to give up to the river Etobicoke, but no farther, nor would they on any account suffer me to cross the river. I then was obliged to stop, rather than run the risk of having any disputes with the Indian chief, who cautioned me against crossing it openly. As Colonel Butler and Mr. Lyons were both gone, I was left without anyone to settle any disputes that might arise between me and the Indians. They told me they did not look upon a straight line as a proper boundary. The creek was a boundary that couldn't be altered or moved, but a line, in a few years, unless always cut open and frequented, would grow up with bush and trees.
How did this place come to be another England? Colonizers come in. They point to the river. They draw it on a map. And then it becomes theirs.
3 of your chiefs agreed to our deal. We have the proof. Totems right there.
Doth hereby acknowledge, and thereof, and therefrom, and from every part or parcel thereof doth acquit
his heirs and
release,
successors and every one
Together with the woods.
doth release,
give peasants
exonerated,
Part
and from heart forever dismissed from his successors,
And also,
the appurtenances and also
and his heirs, yea, at all times, forever should have, destroy, occupy, possess any singular or tract of land, hereditament, determents, or premises, office, and the appurtenances, and every part of parcel, without trouble, molestation, interruption, or disruption of them.
What did Butler promise to our people? How did he get them prevailed upon to give up more land?
All right. So there's a lot in that. I have a few more slides here to get through. So we got to spend some time with the, clearly with that map. So that map threw us for a loop because it seems like that is a finite amount of territory. You're like, oh, yeah, that's how big Toronto is. That's like the center of Toronto. That little additional corner river down there, that whole additional section was also taken in that same day without any payment for it, more or less. Like they ended up getting, it was so little money. It was so little money that the actual treaty negotiator bid with the province, like later on, to say, you got to give them, like, you have to give them more. This is crazy. Sorry. So this is where the Mississaugas ended up living. They became relatively religious, militarist type people. worked with Edgar Ryerson. He was their mission, the guy who created residential schools later. This place, though, was on the other side of the Credit River. So later on, they thought they were safe with their community, but their community was getting so many people coming to rob them often because their community was actually better structurally than the downtown at the time. Like, people didn't have very good houses at the time, so it was actually easier to rip off, to come and steal things from the Mississaugas. So a lot of people were often hassling them, and then another really easy thing that happened soon after was they were getting threatened constantly if they left that territory and went towards the city, because you wouldn't be able to pass anybody's, you'd get your dog, you'd get shot, or someone would take your dogs or whatever, and they would often try to like get them to give them portions of their hunt, things like this, complicated letters that we only would know about because I had spent some time with the petition letters that were written from the Mississaugas to the city early, and to the Crown, saying, you got to stop whatever's happening here. But it didn't stop. So the Mississaugas ended up later on having to move. Look at this, the Haldimand Tract. So the Mississaugas ended up having to move. Do you see that red section? That's Six Nations. And the little kind of square that's cut out of that red section is where the Mississaugas of the Credit live now. So that's the only reserve inside a reserve. But before that, this tract was actually also Mississauga territory. So it's a very long story of trading land back and forth, and the oral history allowed it so that the Mississaugas, the Six Nations, remembered that the Mississaugas at one point let them live there. So later on, the Six Nations said, okay, Mississaugas, it's clear that you have nowhere to go. You're being encroached upon by the surrounding city. Come live with us. We have a little piece of land left, and come live with us. And that's what happened. So that's where they are now. This video and stuff will be presented at the Mississaugas History Conference coming up next month, so we'll see how that goes. I'm just going to end us off with another 1-minute excerpt here. I'll tell you what she says at the end, which is pretty much like a follow-up on this statement. You can't kick people out of a place and give them a little bit of something and expect them to erase their memory of that location. You can't expect to bury a river and not have it seep through your foundations. You can't build something without someone eventually, and especially in Toronto, because we've buried all of the rivers, we've buried all of those hundreds and hundreds of hunting camps and things that would have brought us north in the city to all of the settlements that the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee would have used. Those are buried, essentially, the routes to those locations. So it's just interesting because that stuff will come back up in conversation. I'll end with something kind of horrifying. But one of the conversations we had with Keith Jameson, who's a Haudenosaunee negotiator, talker, governance man, he said, you know, one of the comments that this Lee Maracle makes in this is the reason they were able to take so much land and what, it was because so many of us died. So many, like over a quarter of the, like over 3/4 of the population of Native people in that area died really early. And that's the thing that allowed the swindling of the Toronto Purchase to happen, is that so many people in those few years before the original survey and the confirmation, the people who signed that all died. They all died from alcoholism, from violence, and from complications of essentially people coming to, fights and stuff. But what also happened is the disease took over really quickly. So I just want to bring it back to City Place and think about density, think about the scary thing, actually, that Keith Jameson said in one of the interviews, which is one of the reasons why the Haudenosaunee people were decimated so quickly by disease is because we lived in such close quarters. And I think about living in this condo complex in the basement where there are no vents because it's made shoddily. There's no, air control between the upstairs buildings and our buildings. So we have fruit flies coming through the vents from other units. And there's things like that that make you realize that there's a structural responsibility to putting that many people that close to each other. And also, there's something about additionally reinforcing ideas of how do we make our voices heard when we're in such close quarters and living stacked on top of each other in that way. So, yeah. Great, thank you. That's me.
Okay, good evening. Can't see anybody out of here, but I just wanted to say thank you for the invite, Adrian. And I was saying to Anne, I have never been here before. This is my first time. I'm a fish out of the water, a prairie kid in Ontario. And but I know our students. I know a few of them are here, and seeing them has been a nice treat for me today. And it's honored to be here with your community for a short talk. I want to share with you a little bit about why when I first talked to Adrian on the phone, and why this topic of delineation appealed to me. So it's kind of a bit of why I'm enthused about this and how I came to this. It's a little bit of a different track than the science fiction one, but in my mind not that dissimilar either. The image you see is not far from my hometown. I hope you're all up to date on your Canadian history. This is Batoche in Saskatchewan. And this little township map contains for me a tremendous amount of insights about our country. So you see here, obviously, this is the One Arrow Indian Reserve, and then this is the Dominion grid for the settlers, of course, and then here you have the Métis people and the river lot system through the French along the river. And here you see a first manifestation of different epistemologies and different ways of thinking about the relationship between people and land in one small image. And that to me is what is at the root of this conversation about boundedness. And really I want to just introduce you to something I think a lot about, and this is inherent in almost all of my research and thinking, is about this tension of being contained and yet one's identity being dependent on that contained condition. Okay, so we all in some ways identify as something, and often what we identify with is how we contain ourselves within the world, what separates us, but that can also be our limitation in the world. And that's really, I think it's a fundamental human condition, and it's at the root of how we draw lines or we don't on the land. So I'm going to just kind of go over this in some detail. I was thinking about your poster and the Whole Earth catalog in 1968, and you know, I don't know if you guys are aware of this. People talk about this as the precursor to the World Wide Web. It was the idea that technology would connect everyone together with this profound commitment to ecology and preserving our planet in the wake of looking at it floating in space. And you know, I know Ian McHarg wrote about this a little while ago too, that you know, it's funny well, it's not funny, it's tragic that we are where we are in terms of our relationship to the world that many years later. It's an ongoing conversation. And why? Why are we so slow to get this? And my favorite meme from social media over the last few years, and I'm sure some of you, or if not all of you, have already seen this, but I think it's important. And you know, this is the former dean from Yale School of Forestry talking about this, and you know, saying that he thought that the issues with the environment were biodiversity loss and climate change, and 30 years of good scientists would address it. He said the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy, and to deal with these we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that. I think that is still so profound, because you could substitute architects or planners and a whole bunch of other professions in there, and the same thing is what, and this is at the core of why we're where we are, you know, 60 years going on environmental movements, why we can't seem to get the traction we need. And Douglas Cardinal, who, as you would guess, is a revered elder of mine, I guess, at least a mentor. And in my early conversations with him, I wrote this down at some point, that he's written about this as well, that teachings of the elders are not about the past, but about the future, and our intention is very powerful. Douglas talks about this a lot. So if you think about your intent as a human being and how you guide your day-to-day decision-making, what at the root guides you in your day-to-day. And that leads to this question of a sacredness, and this is where I'll talk a little bit about Indigenous approaches and some of the differences, or if this is, you know, sort of a more secular idea of it. And without some of the teachings, much is lost, and I think that's why we are where we are. Just to link this into this idea of boundary, this is where I was born, in Calgary, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the city, but it's always been quite interesting that the Tsuut'ina Nation is in the southwest corner, and you have this condition where the urban city is growing along the edge of a reserve. And the line between the two is becoming more and more profound. And so this little article came out well, actually I'll just say, but what's interesting is when you pull the box off, the Google box, the land is telling you itself that there are two different sets of intentions in how these groups of people are inhabiting the land. The land is telling us, if you can see it from space, the difference between two different ways of thinking about things. There was an article published in Avenue Calgary magazine, and it was about the walls that divide us in Calgary. And I can't quite see this on my screen, but he interviewed this guy named Corey Cardinal who lives at Tsuut'ina, and he said, "I never felt hemmed in by it. Instead, the fence protects the Tsuut'ina land from the indignities of suburbia." And this goes back to this question of the duality of the line, right, to the suburbanites and the reserve. It talks about in this article that the boundary was meant to keep the Indians out of the way, essentially. That was the intent. But to the Indigenous people living there now, this actually protects them from what's going on outside. So it's a perception of boundary or a protection of one's identity and one's people, or is it supposed to be a cage? And that duality is quite interesting. I don't want to dive into this too much, but I enjoy reading Martin Heidegger, and I'm sure many of you have already taken this kind of stuff in your theory courses. That top line, which I've used in some of my writing, is important. A boundary is not that at which something stops, but as the Greeks recognized, the boundary is that which something begins its essential unfolding, and Heidegger builds a whole thesis around this idea, as you guys would know. And it's interesting if you look at the etymology of this. So within the root word for boundary is bound, and there's two versions of that adjective. The first one is what we would think of being bound, so literally fastening with chains and being restrictive. And the other one is bound, like, you know, bound to succeed, or it's bound to happen, which means that something's going to come into existence. And that's where Heidegger gets into this root word of bauen in German. And what's really cool is if you look at the last line on the second adjective, it says when you add the D, it's presumably through association with the first adjective, which means that there's a link between being bound to dwell and being bound in a restrictive sense. So this is quite interesting, and I had an initial lecture where I was going to really dive into this, but you guys would be here till 10 and you'd hate me by the end of it. So I'm not going to go too much more deep into this, just to say that there's some very interesting linkages, and this actually connects very deeply into Indigenous teachings as well, about what this means to dwell in these conditions. And where it goes wrong, Heidegger's a controversial philosopher, and in my opinion, where the idea of boundary and identity starts to take a difficult path is when it starts to become about the individual and what I own, and my prioritizing and my intent is to protect what I own. And when you start to multiply each individual prioritizing themselves within a group, and as that group gets bigger, you start to get into this idea of border. And this is fundamentally, when I think back to what I was trying to say earlier about boundary and where we're at in the environment, this is at the core of where we're kind of going the wrong directions. So I want to share this. I think it's an interesting project. I never get to really talk about it, but it's probably my favorite thing I've ever done. We were working in Kenya with students many years ago, and we were invited there by an architecture school, and we started off looking at the slums in Nairobi, and this was a map that we use quite a lot, and where they map out the golf courses versus the slums. And what this does when you map something and give it a boundary is you start to think about it as a geographical space, and so this creates a place where everybody wants to go and design and solve. So this is where you get all the photo ops of students going over there working in the slums. You have NGOs and private donations. When in reality, I was reading Saskia Sassen in these times, and really the trick there was to think slum is actually not a place. Slum has nothing to do with its geography. It's actually about its economic systems and how it relates to both rural conditions, to existing economic systems within the city, the relationships of people to all these things. So this is really kind of basic stuff to say that how do you look at spaces without focusing on the boundary. This is an image from rural Kenya where we spent a number of years, which I was surprised to see when I got there. I was a bit naive to know that there was this much fertile land in Kenya. This is right north of Mount Kenya, and this is where the colonizing narrative starts in this context. So that area just north of Mount Kenya is some of the most fertile land, and as you zoom in, you'll see these big swaths of land. The large farms that you're seeing here, which one was it now? These are owned by about 3 or 4 families here. 3 or 4 families own about all of these large plots of land. That's where the photo was taken, and I'm just going to zoom you in. When you think about land division, they're about 5th, 6th generation Kenyans now. As we start to zoom in, the blue things you're seeing, these are actually rose greenhouses where they grow roses for Europe. So all the ones you buy in Holland, they come from here. And as we keep zooming in, now you're going to get to the indigenous Kenyans' farms. And so they're trying to make a living off of this strip of land, and often because of land division, you have the original parents and maybe 2 or 3 of their kids and their families on this trying to grow food for their livelihood in this condition. So what we learned, and the short version, I guess, of this is that they were, through a program, a really great program to increase their yields of potatoes here. They were getting increased yields, but they had no capacity to store their potatoes, so everything was rotting in time. So when we were there and talking to people, what they really needed was a potato store to keep the produce good for longer periods of time to increase their yields. And what we also discovered in this process when thinking about boundaries is that we had all of these farms were basically burning their straw as a waste product. And we had been working in straw bale construction in Montana. And so what the solution we ended up coming up with was this straw bale potato store. And so it's designed as in this vault condition, and there wasn't really anything like this, so this was a total experiment. I did this with a student named Michael Spencer and his design company at the time. A really brilliant guy and entrepreneurial. This whole thing was built without water or power and relied a lot on Indigenous, on these guys in Kenya who helped us with the construction of this. Just so you see how it performs technically, this is a sandstone gravel that we collect water from the roof, and this keeps the moisture level so the potatoes don't shrink. Just a gabion footing to suck in the cooler air, and then using the straw bales for their insulation capacity. And then you plaster this, and these guys all knew exactly. We knew very little Swahili, they knew very little English, and we built this for a month solid with these guys, and it was pretty amazing. So this is how the potato store ends up going. And one of the things that what strikes me about this project in relation to what I'm talking about might not seem related, but this is an architecture that directly derives out of the land division, because you wouldn't have the problem of the small-scale farmer trying to survive against the kind of settler farms if land division was more equitable. And you wouldn't have the waste product from commercial farming on those large slots of land to allow this thing to exist. So in other words, this is an architectural typology that emerges out of the land division. I was quite happy. They just emailed me about a month ago saying that they've now built 15 of these since we left. And they've doubled their income, the people that are using these now. So they've gone from 120 to a ton to a 240 plus, which is pretty cool. We also developed this into a housing, which is also part of our strategy. Going back to the slum projects, is now out of this project, we trained a couple of them, and now they're running a housing company in this region. Before that, straw bale construction was non-existent. They all wanted stone houses like the settlers. Now there's a new typology there, and they're generating income and business out of a waste product, a former waste product in the region. So it's been pretty exciting to see how that went through. Okay, so at home, I'm kind of jumping ahead to some of the things that I'm involved with right now. In 2018, the National Research Council of Canada reached out to me to ask about remote northern housing, and they're putting together a technical specifications book, which is basically going to be like a building code for our remote northern communities, and they wanted to include 5 model homes in the package, and they said, can you coordinate community engagement to give us 5 model homes for all of northern Canada? And I said, I can't do that, because that would go against pretty much everything that I believe in. But I said, I will, if you give me the budget, I will offer 5 model processes with different communities. It ended up being 4, which meant sort of playing by my rules of what it would take to do proper community engagement. I'm also working right now on the Indigenous Service Canada Indigenous Housing Innovation Initiative, so I'm not going to go into that, but it kind of builds off the same ideas. The first thing I did in this was develop an all-Indigenous advisory board. So I flew these people in, some of them from all over Canada. Now I've expanded the group, and some of these guys have become collaborators. To talk about what the issues were with housing, not me trying to, I had my background in Kenya. I am knowledgeable about Indigenous housing to a degree from where I grew up. But I wanted to hear from everybody. And what's really cool, and why I want to emphasize this, is that when you get to know Indigenous communities, often I think architects have far too much ego. You got guys like Chuck Patagagoose here, who's been dealing with housing for 20 years. This new guy that joined, Larry Jones, he's from Yellowknife. This is a guy that goes for coffee with Yohani Palazma, reads as much theory as anybody here. He speaks the language, and he's been working on housing in the Northwest Territories with communities for 30 years. He's just a genius. And it's very humbling when you sit down with these people and realize that there's been a lot going on this, and the knowledge is there. Just very quickly, I would say that the issue with housing, I'm not going to go into any detail, is that if you take something with a life system, which a house is a living product of an economy and a society, and you take it and cut it from its life sources and plop it into a context where it can't live properly as an artifact, it dies. And this is the whole issue with housing. And so I developed, after our first few meetings, this diagram that I just drew one day to say, what is a house? And how, this idea of boundary of the house is really, or the form of the house is irrelevant to me. It matters on how it connects one to the relationships around them. So intergenerational and the land and the people. And so that diagram, depending on where you drop it, each community is going to have a different response to what housing for them should be. And so the key here is to let it be community driven and also work with Indigenous communities. So we looked at the geophysical regions of Canada, and then we went through a whole process. This took quite a long time actually we wanted to be inclusive, so we sent an expression of interest out to every tribal council across Canada, and then we ended up agreeing with these 4 communities with the advisory board. And then we working now with Indigenous architects who are doing these. So a lady of Smoke Architecture is working with Haudenosaunee Cree Nation. And these involve multiple visits to go back and talk with them and develop what they would put in here. Brian Porter from Two Row Architects, just around here, is working with Fort Severn, and he's also partnering with KPMB on this. There's their first, one of their first sketches for this. So the designs are now starting to come together, and I'm hoping to package this all together eventually. And this is Alfred Waugh of Formline, who you may know. And the thing with Alfred and all of these cases is trying to put architects in a condition where there's no pressure to be an anthropological architect. There's no cultural, education needed. There's no cultural fluency lessons. You kind of arrive, you go fishing, you do the things, you talk about the stories about your dad and your community, and out of that process, architecture starts emerging. And I'm very supportive of Indigenous architects for those reasons. And Alfred, in all of these cases, Haudenosaunee, imagine being a young girl in Haudenosaunee First Nation, and a lady of Smoke arrives as the lead designer, and how that can motivate you as a young person and your agency in the world. So there's Alfred's project that he's putting together. So these are all going to be put together in a document coming up. Very lastly, and I know I'm probably over time, I want to share this one with you because we don't get, it's very little publicity, but I think it's actually an immensely important story that needs to be told. Last year, the Assembly of First Nations were working with a few firms. You may remember that the government gifted 100 Wellington Street to the Indigenous people space, which is a Cass Gilbert building. In our mind as Indigenous architects, it was a bit of a jaw dropper because how you can imagine giving a colonial building designed for an American embassy to Indigenous people and expect everyone to embrace it with open arms seemed a bit crazy. They started to work with a few firms and basically in their words they felt they just weren't being listened to. They felt like firms just didn't get what they were trying to say, and so they stopped that process and reached out to the Indigenous architects, put out their own RFP, and we went in joint venture with Wanda Delacosta and Aledia Smokeneye. And what we did differently is we created a team with Inuit, First Nations and Métis. Winnie Petawanakwit is the elder we asked to be on our team, and we paid her the same rate per hour as we took on ourselves, and we thought that was a statement to say that she holds every bit of spatial intelligence as us on something like this. So I want to just run through this. I think it's a long story. Here's the Parliament building. There's this little beautiful gem. It's a beautiful building, Cass Gilbert design, and this is everything that's orange in here is what they gifted to the AFN. And then they told us that you could go 7 stories on this little box right here, and this would be where we could indigenize things. And Wanda Delacosta sat at the meeting and she said, so you're saying we can indigenize the extruded loading dock? That's what we can indigenize on this building across from Parliament Hill? Are you serious? And then they told us we weren't allowed to go beyond this property line. So one of the first things in these conversations, Winnie said to us, we were debating about this property line because this plaza is kind of a leftover space right now in our mind. And Winnie said, design a building that your grandmothers would be inspired by and would approve. Do that only. So what we ended up doing, and this relates to the property line, and it made a lot of people frustrated with us in Ottawa, is we just said, we don't care about the property line. We're going for it. So it's not going to get built for that reason, by the way. Anyways, just to set up the basic scheme, you're aware of the Centennial Flame. We felt it would be appropriate to create a nation-to-nation access. If you're going to talk about it politically, do it spatially. Put a sacred fire here, which would be the time immemorial fire in relationship to this centennial fire. And this creates an east entry for the Algonquin people, which is really important. The basic partie of our scheme was to do this. So again, we create a nation-to-nation access. We bring back the land, which is so important. So we create a kind of park space here for people there. Then we look at the wigwam as a kind of structuring element. The wigwam is often built with 2 shells or 2 rows of structure with the bark between. And then this comes from Winnie again. She said, well, what do we do with that Cass Gilbert building? Many people along the way have just wanted to blow it away, but we can't. It's a heritage building. And she said, in our culture, when you are given a gift, you honor that gift. And we often do it with a blanket around the shoulders. So we said we're going to honor the gift by wrapping it. And it also referred to the Métis sash, so we thought the sash could wrap the building as well. It's hard to be pan-Indigenous, which is kind of a whole critique of all this. And then we would put regalia in the project as well. So I just wanted to share this. Like I said, this won't actually ever get built, but it gives them a vision of what happens when you put a group of Indigenous people together and give them the design reign and what kind of things would happen. You'll notice here this is the Turo Wampum Belt that we would put in the paving that would connect the 2 fires. And then each one of these were designed to be for each First Nation to design and put them on there themselves so that each community would see their artisans represented across from Parliament Hill. So again, the property line here becomes a bit of an urban confusion. And it's funny, I'm not going to go into this in any detail because it relates exactly to what Ange said. This is written by Nijon Sinclair, and it's worth it what you actually put up, Ange, about the idea of the house and somebody coming into your house. And I really encourage you to read this if you didn't catch it on CBC, because I think it captures a lot. So that's it for me. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Ange and David. I think I wanted to start with a question about making conversation. I feel like making space for conversation, something that, or you said decisions together. How do we make decisions together? But I feel like both of your practices really privilege this idea that you're artists in different ways, architect and artist, but that cultural products are produced in conversations, discussions in different ways. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that. Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about, I guess, we had this conversation on the way over, and I also had a conversation just now. And I've been thinking, I'll mention this thing I've been thinking about a bit with that is, like a lot of the Indigenous governance structures here, Anishinaabe, let's say for example, decision-making processes where you have to come to a sharing circle and say, the youngest person talks first, and then someone a little bit older adds to the conversation, and it moves around a circle to one of the older people putting their point in. And it's a similar structure where whoever initiates the conversation, it still moves through the same people, the consultation mode. This is for like a family house. There's a similar process, I would say, that style of making a decision, coming to a location where it's pretty much structured who sits where and how the conversation will be passed along, is important, I guess, for creating a space. And how even like with Haudenosaunee culture, we have like a whole process. If you were living in a more traditional governance style, there are processes within your clan system to get your voice heard, even from the smallest person to the more senior orator, you know what I mean? And that orator's duty is to represent its constituent, that their constituency, let's call that. And those are all the little people, all the regular people, like all us regular people. So what are the forms we have in our own houses and political structures that allow that kind of communication to go from a very small individual to a very large policy discussion? Those ideas aren't necessarily, those aren't in place in a Western forum, except for going to a city hall meeting. There's, you know, once in a while you get to vote, but like we don't really have a lot that built into our architecture, our structures, the way that we come together, talk, inspire innovation. I was mentioning this just as an example is science students, the study about science students at universities that have a beautiful, comfortable science student lounge that has food, that has nice tables, that has places for them to meet and talk with each other outside of their individual labs. This is like graduate student scientists, right? When you have a school that has this nice space for people to come together, the ideas are so much better. The innovation level is so much higher because people have a chance to get out of their little individual unit, come down and interrelate with each other. And that conversation of like, yes, architects don't know how to solve all of the problems. That's the problem, is that we're not building those spaces that allow for that conversation to continually happen, an ongoing conversation. There's no space where, I don't know, where would you be able to make a choice with your neighborhood at this time period?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question in our profession right now, and I feel like I was with a firm earlier today, we're asking this exact same question. You know, doing work with community, how do we do it? A lot of people are curious. How do you get in conversation over these issues? And a lot of people are, and maybe you guys are seeing this too, there's a lot of trepidation because people are sensitive. I don't want to cross a boundary that I shouldn't say. Am I culturally appropriating? Am I being inappropriate? I want to help, I want to design, I'm good intended. And I actually think that we're in very preliminary stages in our country of understanding how to come to the table in productive ways, and it'll take time. Some of the things that I thought of when you said that, one of the things that can't be emphasized enough is the importance of language. You remember that when with Indigenous communities, when you're in conversation, you're speaking in a language that actually is an alien language. And so much is lost in there. So that's an issue. And then the other thing that I'm trying to encourage people to do in our field is, and I hope all of you students will celebrate who you are as individuals, because often there's, how do I say this, a way of discourse at a boardroom table, let's say, in a firm, down to the body language and who speaks first and what happens. And you just assume, because that's what the world you grew up in, that a firm handshake, particularly for a man, let's just say, a firm handshake from a man means, yes, we're doing a good deal together. This is a sign of respect for each other almost. Indigenous cultures, don't go down that path. It can be very offensive for many Indigenous people to reach out with a very firm handshake. Those little things, right? The tone of your voice. I've spoken to Indigenous architects who are on teams with non-Indigenous architects, and at a certain point in the conversation, they think, everything's great in this meeting, community's engaged, everything, and it's the way, the delivery, and so we're all taught in school to be confident and firm and stand up, and the way that was delivered, this colleague of mine said, I could tell right there within a 30-second, as soon as they stood up and started talking, we are out, we lost the project. Right? Because they didn't know how to communicate in a way that would be received. And so this is what I mean, like I see often in my life, I'm seeing that people, even today in an academic setting, I think, you talk to people and you're like, oh yeah, I think they get it, right? They read it, they're in position, and then you see them in action, you're like, oh, there's still a big gap there. So for me, conversations, and I think what you just said is profound, because what we can't do is say, well, you can't converse on this and you can't converse on that. That's not going to help anything, but it's going to take time and patience to figure out how to do that in a good way.
Thinking about this email I got a few months ago from an architecture firm, and they said, we have 3 days to put in a proposal. Can you be the native artist who will sign off on being the curator for the art in the lobby? We just need to put it into the city. This is a $3 million project. We just need your name. And I was like, this is what not to do, right? Yeah, then you easily look up the firm and you realize this is just what they do, right? This is part of their game, but it's everyone's game. It's just been interesting to finally be identified as being, because I know how they found me. I worked for the city and I worked for a project planning thing, and they must have just gone through and typed Indigenous Artists Toronto, and I came up on the list. I know that's how it happened because I'm not a curator,
Actually, I was going to add, one of the things I think is what our collaboration, let's say, Adrian, on this topic, to me, this is a very valuable idea, because when you talk about property, it's going to affect all of us. Everyone in this room is affected by property and always has been. And the younger generation, particularly affordability, your lifestyles, everything is going to impact you and your children as it has us. This is a topic that Indigenous people are deeply invested in, and we all are deeply invested in it. And so for me, like, what are those water? We all are impacted by water. This is a sacred thing to Indigenous people. They're going to come to the table. So rather, sometimes I think there's an urge to, I don't know what I'll call it, an age of awareness about Indigenous peoples in this country. There's a tendency to just want to jump into the Indigenous topic, and that's where I think things can go sideways a bit. Let's find the common grounds. That's something that roots us all together, something productive we can all do and figure out together. That's a really great idea, I think.
I've been playing with this kind of visual image. I'm working with this thing coming up for Luminato, which is a museum of water, in a sense, where people bring in some water and tell stories about their importance. But I was just talking about this image of buried rivers, but also essentially, if you looked at the condoscape of the whole Toronto cityscape, and say you removed all of the outer layers, and you left only the pipes and the water flowing through those buildings, you'd have a grid-type structure going into the sky with little spouts of water coming out and more little grids bringing that in back to the ground. And if you envision the condos as these water spires, the city becomes something else. The city becomes a place where you are still putting things in the rivers. You are, because you're still you're still spitting your toothpaste into the sink. You're still peeing your birth control into the water. You're still dumping your turkey grease. You know what I mean? Like, it's still there. It's just that we don't see them. And like, how do we talk about water and river and water access when it's in our walls? Like, it's a whole other conversation, but it's not unrelated, because you wouldn't put you wouldn't put the same thing in your sink that you put down your sink in your toilet. You wouldn't go to a river and dump that, you know? So it's just this interesting conversation, particularly, don't get me started about sewage and consultation and all of that, but it's a big conversation in Toronto. Yeah.
Maybe we should open it to the floor if anyone has a question.
Good evening, and thank you very much for this interesting seminar, I would call it. My name is Sam Shukur. I'm a practicing architect. I admired the concept of a wrapping blanket as a unifying element to the gift, regardless whether the gift was sort of harsh or in the wrong place. But now, because I'm interested in the green architecture and sustainability in general, I was wondering, what are the boundaries from your philosophy, or from the Indigenous people philosophy? What are the boundaries that, I mean, I know that a lot of what has been discussed today was cultural, but we are also creating a new movement with a new culture, with a new mindset, with a new approach. What are the similarities or the boundaries that could never blend together between the sustainable movement and the green movement, including the holisticness, or if that's the right word, of environment and humans and human society and Indigenous thoughts and philosophies? Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a great line of investigation, and obviously there are huge similarities. In fact, so right now at the McEwen School of Architecture we have an international advisory board, and one of the members of our board is Jason McLennan. He's the founder of the Living Building Challenge, and he's a very inspiring speaker. And when you read his words, because I find in a way the Living Building Challenge, as an example, is a unifier for sustainability in some ways, and I think the best metric for sustainability because of the layering to it. And it captures a lot of what Indigenous peoples value. I think that you start to get some very close overlap. And I see Brian Porter's name on the list here. He'll probably mention in his mind that, you know, Europeans started here and Indigenous people have always been here. And slowly this wave is starting to come this way. If you think like 30 years ago, sustainability, you know, Indigenous people's teachings were there, and now we're starting to see that it's no longer, you're not going to be labeled a tree hugger or a hippie architect anymore. It's like we're all doing that, right? So there is this idea of them coming together, and I think for me it actually relates to that slide that I had with the whole Earth catalog, and right, that where it's different for me is I think a lot about this, the idea of the secularization of thinking, critical thought, actually. I've got a whole lecture on critical thought and indigeneity and why those two are in conflict with each other. But it comes back to sacredness and spirituality. And you can be sustainable, let's just say a lead person, you know, you stamp your building lead, you may not have ever any spiritual connection to the place that you're doing that for. And Douglas Cardinal would say that if you don't have a spiritual investment in the land and every critter and every fish and every bird and every plant involved in that system, if you don't have a spiritual connection to it all, you're never going to be in the same place in terms of prioritizing it. You know, Douglas's comments, and I feel like I'm I'm a disciple of his here. But Douglas, he gave such a powerful talk last year at a housing conference, and it blew the room away, and he was just on spot that day. He was like lecturing. It was mainly city planners and developers, actually. And he said, as human beings, you have two responsibilities. Ultimately, you have two. You love and protect each other, and you love and protect Mother Earth. That's it. If everything you do in life, if you can come back to those two fundamental principles, go for it, right? But as soon as you got to be able to stand up and say when you divert away from those. And so, I believe that a lot of the teachings in the Indigenous people and the value of the land, it's at another level. But to be truthful, all cultures had that. Europeans as well. European cultures, there's a very deep similarity around the world of this. It's just whether we come together and we all are not afraid to develop that again together, right? Like, that's important.
That was funny. I was just reading, I just watched like TED Talks about how to make a hard choice. It's really just as a funny side note. But one of the things that the woman was talking about was how sometimes you have to look at all the layers of the things that are informing what you think your choice will be. So do you want to, you have to always consider, especially when the choices are both on the table, you have to consider like what's making you want to go with the one that's going to make you more money, what's making you want to go with the one that's going to whatever. And very often you want to put environmental factors ahead of that. That's, you want to make a big shift. We got to ask ourselves those questions instead. What would be better for those bugs? That's kind of like the foundational teaching here. I guess in this territory, if you consider yourselves within the territory of the Haldimand Tract, it's like a lot of us do the Ahanda it's for a reason. The reason they do the opening address, where you mention the people, the animal, all the things from the ground all the way up to the sky, the natural entities and the beings in the space. And you do that at the beginning of a large meeting, even for like a big, some big meeting where you have to make a big choice. The reason you do that is so that it's all at the table. Everything's on the table. You have all of those things in your mind, and you've actually brought yourselves to one mind, which means more or less you all understand that we're not only talking about humans here, that the decisions we're making impact a lot more out there, and it's an environmentalist, I guess, ideal. I just think about like the great work is happening in Six Nations. I love it's not permaculture. It's like better than permaculture. It's just, putting all the right plants in the place and leaving them there forever. But how much work we do with, as artists, like how invested I am in like things that, make art out of invasive species and that, get a chance to really shake things up in a way, but that reinforce what the land needs, which is a diversity of local foliage. And there's like a really great study that actually was done by the Six Nations, one of their environment agencies, where they identified all local Indigenous plants in the area, and just intrigued by what that could mean for Toronto, because it's the same lake, right? Like how do we add stuff back to those areas that support not only the buildings, but just the people inside those buildings and the animals that want to be on those waterways, particularly. Yeah, it's a larger question than just the buildings. It's, the indigeneity and indigenizing of a place is like, I don't want to stay inside. We're also talking about this idea of, how in Toronto, nobody gets to live alone very often? You don't get to have your own apartment because it's absolutely unfeasible financially. So everybody has to live with 3 or 4 people, right? Or like a couple people, and you have to live in these dirty mansions, and you have to live in these small bento box condo buildings. And I watched another video about how people are, I would say, like outsourcing parts of their homes. So they'll go to the gym in a different place, they'll get their coffee in a different place, they'll go get their relaxation times in a completely different place that's shared in like a big condo kind of like zone, or they'll go to the cafe down the street, or they'll go to the library to do different things. That's where they study. They don't study at their bedroom with their stuff because it's the same room they have to be in 24/7. That plus how people have been living in these dirty mansions where you have to share a kitchen and share a bathroom with essentially strangers that you're also renting from, renting with. It really shows that in times of need, people are willing to go outside of their comfort zones, and people are willing to not have the most amazing Western style life. And nobody gets to have garage anymore. Nobody, it's just, that's that simple. In the future, no one gets to have this thing. And because we can't, and there's these kind of choices that are made as individuals in a Western scheme, which are actually pretty Indigenous processes, you know, trying to find community outside of your box, because we can't leave people in the air in a box and expect them to be engaged with the ground.
How, to kind of follow up on this question about climate change, the subject of our lecture series, how do you see the abstraction of property as something that is fundamental to battling this problem of climate change? I mean, I think certainly your work, Ange, just focused a lot, recently anyway, on this one exchange of a big piece of property for a certain small paltry amount of money, but it cascades and becomes all these other things. Anyway, yeah, I'm wondering if you could both address this question about the relationship between the way this abstraction that Europeans invented is fundamental to climate change.
Yeah. There's been letters going back. This is part of one of those texts that I was like part of this video. Like texts, letters going from the Mississaugas to the Crown, pretty much saying, hey, keep your eye on York because they are letting so many factories come up on these rivers. We can't even get fish up the Humber River now. Let's try to make some negotiation. So our village is downstream a little bit more, so maybe on Saturday and Sunday we won't fish there to make sure that the fish can make it up a little bit higher. There's all these negotiations that the Native Nations tried to do really early with regards to making sure that access to clean water, access to those rivers are still possible, and that they could have access to them. And there was like and how the factories were screwing things up, filling them with pulp and soap super early. Like the fish left that river, the Humber, super early, and then they moved to the Credit River. And even the Etobicoke River is currently right now the most polluted creek in that whole north shore of Lake Ontario. It's super polluted. And that creek is actually never been seeded. That's one of the things we found out with doing our research, is that creek was supposed to have been set aside as something that the Mississaugas would be able to have stewardship and ownership of. And then that kind of got taken away by putting the Queen's Rangers, giving them a huge allotment of land right at that creek base. And then very soon after, that allotment expanded over the creek, and then it never got mentioned again in future treaties. But right now the Mississaugas have a current land claim in for the waterfront. So how do you think about the waterfront when the shoreline's shifting? Like, especially considering even Toronto, we want to talk about land claims and complications. Toronto filled in miles of land for their waterfront. Like, what does that mean when saying that the agreement was up to the water? So it's a lot of complicated stuff, but I would say the Mississaugas are, they want more consultation. We talked to this guy that worked at the history department there, and he was just speaking about how he wishes the consultation was better, because there's not enough consultation from the city with what's happening, keeping people faster than just showing one page of a brief of how the changes are going to happen in the city. And the one Mississauga person who's there for that consultation meeting has to say, okay, that's what consultation looks like in Toronto right now. And I'm sure here also, if they're consulting with Native people in your municipality. But yeah, just to say there's more.
That's a loaded question. The easy one that I keep thinking about in this conversation in terms of property is, if you look traditionally, again, people say, oh, that's primitive, but communities were very mobile. They were very, they could adapt really quickly. You know, so I just think like you think of any river flooding situation where somebody's property is going under, and the property values are tied to how far away from the river you are, or whether you're in a flood zone. And so, you know, nowadays, like what climate, I mean, Indigenous people would have said, well, the water's rising, let's just move back 20 yards, and next year we'll keep moving back, and maybe this land's no good, let's take off and go away. But the permanence of private property, right, there's like an attachment to it then. It's like, I own that. Which again, I've heard many elders tell me over the years, what do you think you own when you own that? Do you own each blade of grass? Do you think you own that ant's life on your property? Like, what do you own, actually? What do you think you own in this scenario? You know, but we get so attached to this idea that we own it, it's ours, and then people are standing there in like a hurricane or something, like their life is at risk because they don't want to, they can't move. Because of what, do you just lose your house, you don't get compensation for your land, and now you're in poverty. So again, the fear of loss. So I think private property is implicated just in our ability to adapt to the changes. That's one of the major issues. Of course, it contributes to everything in my mind. That you go to that suburban house and look at the carbon footprint of suburbia on the world is clearly devastating. And it's not just the buildings themselves for heating and cooling, whatever else. It's also the production of all the stuff we have in there. Like, think of what you said earlier, and imagine the street of suburbia and how many toasters are sitting on that street and collectively unused for 99.9% of the time, and how many, all the objects in your house, like there's literally, the street is full of stuff that at one given time nobody's using. Like, and then there's all the factories producing all that stuff, and these manufactured landscapes, right? So, but that's all because you have a piece of land, and on your piece of land you need your lawnmower, and you need all the little things that you do, your hair blowers. So like, that's what drives economies, and that's where, again, I don't want to go on a Marxist rant, but I mean, capitalism is behind all of this. It's obvious, right? That this is, there's no coincidence, like private property and capitalism both kind of emerge around the same point in history, and they both proliferate. And that climate change happens to follow that exact same timescale. Like there's no mystery to all of this.
I was talking about the research about, I looked up band, and then a touring band, right? And you would, just to guess, what would be the highest carbon output that a touring band would make for touring venue to venue. You would assume it would be the gas in your car or just operating your car. But actually, the highest carbon imprint is from printing vinyl, printing CDs, and the travel that your audience has to make to come to your venue, and the venue's input from having to serve everyone beer in plastic cups, and the hotel for having to put up that many people every night for the couple every day we go on tour. So it's actually not the travel. So just thinking about that world of where are we making our imprint, and how does that even relate to close quarters? If I did a show in the basement of my condo that I work in, I would cut out 5 of those factors. You know, it's this interesting place about closeness, access, and all those extra things. You know, I don't know. So it's I just also say this is where I'll just end with. This is one room in a house that is in Kahnawake, which is not all of us have it. It's called an Haudenosaunee, and it's. I mean, some people refer to it as a mud room, I guess. Like it's in old, large houses. It's the room where you do things that are dirty. So how much having a place like that actually impacts your ability to live a traditional life, and how that kind of place, I don't know what it's called in English really, but they're referred to as an Haudenosaunee. I don't know what that term even means, but how even access to the words of architecture and the words of Indigenous architecture change. Because I'm sure it means the place where things get dirty, you know? And then that means my job is to make something dirty in my life, and to make a mess, and to cook things for pan, and to pull out my big pots, and to skin something. And it's the place where you can do that. And how that impacts environmental standards when you have the tools and the locations to make something and access to things like those. It's great. Things about school libraries and how can you get things without having to have everything. How can you have a place to live without needing all the necessities of a Western environment? Good question. Many people have been doing it for a long time.
Okay, maybe we'll have one last question over here. You can do the end of 7:30. We only have one question for the audience.
Hey, thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting. This is more of like a sharing of experience. So last year I was away on exchange, and last semester I actually got the opportunity to go to rural communities in Japan and learn a bit more about their lifestyle. And what you're basically saying exactly is like kind of the traditional lifestyle in Canada very much relates to the small economies that I experienced over there, especially regarding fishing. And in fact, like these small towns which got really affected by the tsunami, 3/11, are now like trying to recover. And so it's really interesting. Like they have this whole community model where in every community they have a community house, and so it's a place for community members to meet. The care of the rivers is incredibly important because it affects the oyster and fish production. The vernacular architecture that emerges because they have like one carpenter in the community and they need to kind of share the resources. It's not, I think, architecture with a capital A is very different than architecture with a lowercase a. And I think architects just being open and kind of smart about just like what is a building and what does it actually do. It's not about like building 20-story buildings all the time. I don't think that's actually what architecture is. So I appreciate your conversation very much. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Ange and David, for sharing this talk with us.